Okay, it is day 14, our second to last day of Esther. Tomorrow, you've done it. You would have finished the plan. If you're a few days behind, don't worry. Just take your time getting caught up. We'll have a whole week in between this plan and our next plan, which starts on February 7th. But right now, all I want to do in the next few minutes that we have together is talk about somewhat of a controversial chapter within Esther, and it starts in chapter 9. It's the story of how the Jewish people basically turn the tables on their enemies, and they use violence to do it. And no surprise, this can be a little troubling to us. The Jews go from being this persecuted minority in the city to now being on the front lines of battle, and it seems like they're the ones who are instigating it, at least in this story. But here's what I want to challenge you to do. Before you read into this, using your Western brain, the brain that we've been trained to use, the way that we think about the world, I want you to pause and take a step back and view this story through the lens of the original readers and for who it was written for. And when we do that, I think we'll see some things about this story that may not change the way we feel about it by any means, but may at least put it into perspective in a way that will help us understand what's trying to be communicated here. Now remember, we are reading biblical narrative. That doesn't mean that everything that happened is factual or it happened exactly in this way, like you would read in a history book. Everything that you're reading in this whole book, anytime you read biblical narrative, is first and foremost about communicating truths about God and God's people. It's a theological work. It's meant to tell a story. It's meant to pass along different themes. It's not first and foremost meant to communicate historical truth, although it can do that at the same time. So with all of that in mind, let's take a look at this story starting in chapter 9. I'm going to be reading through a different, out of a commentary, so it may sound a little bit different than what you're used to with the ESV, but just kind of follow along with me and I think it'll make sense. So in chapter 9, we read about, it's right before the king's original edict is about to unfold. And so the Jews were, for this whole story, preparing to be destroyed by their enemies. Now they're going to turn the tables, and instead of being in fear of destruction, they're going to be the ones who go out and get victory over their enemies. Look at verse 1. On the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day therein, when the king's command and his rule came to be enacted, that's the original one, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to dominate them. On the contrary, it was the Jews who dominated their foes. That's the message that you hold on to through as you're reading the rest of what's about to happen. The Jews who were bent for destruction because of the work of all of these people who hated them for whatever reason, including Haman, who was the leader of the charge, where they thought that they were going to be victorious, the Jews flipped the script. Remember, Esther is all about these great reversals. Here's another one that's happening, and this time it's the Jews who will gain mastery over their enemies. This idea of gaining mastery over your enemy is less about just brute force, but it's also about you're gaining the upper hand both in authority, in the way that you're ruling over them. It's a lasting impact, not a one-time thing. The Jews assembled in their cities, all the provinces. Look down at verse 3. Here's something I found really interesting. All the ministers of the provinces, all the satraps and the governors, and those who carried out the king's task were raising up the Jews for fear of Mordecai. So it's not even just the Jews that are going to fight on their behalf. All of the governors, officials in the king's court actually go to bat for the Jews themselves. And we're told it's out of fear of Mordecai. Now that word in the Bible, fear, can either mean fear, like trembling, he's become a big deal in the king's court, so we better, be on his side. We don't want to be caught on the other side away from him. But it can also mean this respect. They've come to respect him. They see him as a wise figure, someone worth following. I think it's probably a little bit of both that's happening here. because it even says, for great was Mordecai in the house of the king. So there's probably a little bit of motivation from a political alliance, but there's probably also this, he's become this great figure in the land. He's worth following. He's got some respect. So even the Gentiles fight for the Jews. And we know that in the previous chapter, the people of Susa, many of them across the region declare themselves for the Jews, whether that be through religious conversion or whether that be just, hey, we're with you, we're on your side. And so the only people who the Jews are going after at this point in this story are those who are their sworn enemies, the ones who have marked themselves against the Jews. And we see that here, even as the governor's officials, the Jews are not enacting some sort of genocide against the Gentile people in the region. They're going after the ones who are bent on their destruction. I think that is a really important thing to keep in mind. And here's the last two things. Twice at least in the story that I could find, it may even be more, we're told specifically that the Jews don't take the spoils. They kill their enemies, they're victorious over them, and even though Mordecai's edict that he worked out with the king allowed them to do so, they don't lay a hand on the spoils. This tells me that their motivation is not about gaining wealth or total annihilation of all these people and what their plunder. This is not about lifting up themselves and putting themselves in a better position financially. This is about gaining victory over people who wanted to see them dead, so they don't touch the spoil. And in the email, I talk a little bit more in detail about how that relates back to a previous story with King Saul. So go check that out if you haven't already. And here's the other thing. In the original edict that the king and Mordecai worked out, the Jews were given permission to destroy all their enemies, men, women, and children. But nowhere in here, in this chapter, where it's telling us what actually happened, do I see women and children being slaughtered here. So even though in the edict it was a way of saying all of your enemies can be destroyed, what I see is the Jews actually just taking out this edict on those who were militarily ready to do them harm and bring them and destroy them, basically. So that's what I see in this. The last thing I would point out is in verse 16, the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled, defended their lives. Here's a key word here. They had respite from their enemies. Now, this idea of having rest from your enemies, it's an important one. Again, we talked about in the beginning, the Jews have been living in fear of this edict, knowing that their end date, the date of their destruction, was marked on the calendar. Now, after they've turned the tables and destroyed their enemies, they're able to sit back and finally have rest. This idea of rest is one of peace. It's peace after military conquest. It's we can breathe again. For the first time in a long time, almost a year, the Jews don't have to live in fear of their lives being destroyed because of this edict. And it's no surprise then that the next chapter we read about talks about the festival that they plan to celebrate this moment, very similar to Passover. It's a moment where they are rescued and saved from a fate of ultimate destruction. So here's what I want to leave you with. Anytime in the Bible you come across these stories that rub against your sensibilities a little bit or make you feel uncomfortable, use that as a sign to do a little more digging. Don't set aside the way we view the world forever, but set it aside for just the first time you read through the story. Try to view it through a lens of the original readers, the original people who it was written for, and see if you can figure out what it meant to them first, and then bring it back into our world. The Bible was written thousands of years ago in a completely different culture. So first, if we want to understand what the authors are trying to communicate to us here today, we have to see it through their eyes first. We have to put ourselves in their shoes. And until we do that, will always kind of come to this uncomfortable relationship with the story. Remember, these are narratives. These are not meant to be just historical documents, but stories that are rich in theological themes and ideas and pictures about how we are called to relate to God and view who God is. I hope that gives you some peace about the reading for today. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. I would love to hear from you about what you're taking away from stories like this. Tomorrow's the last day. Good luck. We'll see you back in another week for the next reading plan after tomorrow.